Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's search session hosted by the University of Michigan Electric Vehicle Center. My name is Christophe Mengen. I'm the Managing Director of the Electric Vehicle Center. We are excited to welcome a speaker who is deeply involved in the EV policy landscape at the national level, Michael Maten, Director of the EV policy at General Motors. Michael has been with General Motors for almost 25 years in roles ranging from electrification strategy to government relations. He holds a degree from the University of Michigan College of Engineering and University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and has been a key player in advancing the policies and partnership that are helping shape the EV future in the US, from critical mineral sources to sourcing to infrastructure build out and federal incentives. He will walk us through the current EV policy environment, what's working, what's changing, and what lies ahead. Please join me in welcoming Michael Maten. Michael, go ahead.
Thank you, Christophe. Let me just hopefully share my screen here. And Christophe, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Thank you. So welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks to the Christophe and the U of M EV Center team for having me. Sorry, just getting my screens arranged here. Today, I wanted to talk about electric vehicles from a public policy perspective. I spent the last 7 years or so in the policy space after an early career spent in product development and planning in General Motors with a particular focus on electric vehicles. I moved into the policy space because I understood even back then what an outsized role policy will have in the development and evolution of this market. So I'll give about a 35-minute presentation. I want to make sure and leave plenty of time at the end for questions. And given the short time we do have today, this is going to be a fairly high-level overview. But I do hope to provide you a framework from which to think about electric vehicle policy and how a company like General Motors factors policy into the strategic decisions we have to make as a large global auto manufacturer. So when we think about EV policy, I wanted to break that into some distinct elements. When we define policy, right, it's really a combination at the simplest level of carrots and sticks, working in concert with each other to influence and respond to market conditions. Industries, whether it's the auto industry, the computer industry, the consulting industry, right? Businesses really want stable and durable policies by which they can make their long-term business plans. But if it's specifically electric vehicle policy, I like to think about it in three buckets. The regulatory bucket, right? So that involves greenhouse gas vehicle emissions regulations, zero-emission vehicle mandates, fuel economy regulations, but that's kind of just the start of it, right? The other regulations that impact our industry and are especially important from an EV perspective, recycling, when it comes to battery recycling and circular economy, EV and battery safety, certainly a topic that's top of mind for regulators. And then, right, chemical regulation, whether it's PFAS or the regulation around some of the battery materials. So a strong regulatory policy focus for EVs. But then the other, and I would say that's mostly in the sticks category. The carrots are things like technology incentives. So you can think of technology incentives from the consumer standpoint, right? EV subsidies for EV purchase, tax credits, and things like that. You can also think of incentives for manufacturers, whether it's tax credit for production, whether it's R&D funding, or whether it's grants and loans for expansion of operations. So again, these can come in the form of tax credits. They can come in the form of grants or loans. And specifically in this space, you also have to be very aware of, I'll call it the strings that are attached to any of those. The government as a lender or the government as a grantor often has stipulations that you must follow, especially when it comes to workforce. And then the third category, of course, trade is getting a lot of attention, whether it's free trade agreements, tariffs, export controls, things like that. Trade, obviously, with the majority of the supply chain taking place in China, or in Asia rather. Trade becomes a real area of focus in the EV policy space. So, kind of those are, I would call, the core policy elements. But then you have connected policies, right? Things that are not maybe directly, but definitely at least tangentially related. So the utility space. The involvement in the utility space from the auto industry has historically been low utility rates for our manufacturing operations, right? But now we are much more interconnected with utilities because electricity is, quite frankly, the fuel for these vehicles. So getting electricity into these vehicles, whether it's through public fast charging deployment across our highways, or whether it's getting getting chargers into residences or multifamily housing or workplaces, the involvement with the utility industry has really increased. Labor and workforce are always top of mind for the auto industry, whether it's things like organized labor, considerations, or in the EV industry. I think one of the key areas is how do we train our workforce for this future, how to handle EV batteries, how to assemble vehicles with EV batteries, how to make EV batteries, how to service chargers. What does that workforce of the future look like as we moved into an electrified transportation future? And then finally, the other one that I wanted to point out that's really become top of mind, at least in the state legislatures and a little bit at the federal level, road funding. How do we pay for the roads? And how do EVs pay for their fair share of the roads, especially since they're not paying the gas tax? Now, EVs are still a fairly small percentage of the vehicles on the road right now, but they will be an ever increasing percentage, and we need to figure out that road funding mechanism. So again, and this is not an exhaustive list. There are others. I tried to highlight again kind of the key ones that we see coming up at a federal and a state and even a local level. So now that we kind of talked about the scope of the policy levers, what does that policy life cycle look like, and who are the players involved? On the left-hand side, I show, right, the policy playing field, or the playing field, or the steps that policy goes through. You formulate policy, you adopt policy, you then implement it. Again, the auto industry works on long time frames. The policy is then evaluated and then maintained, or new policies are adopted. And this seems like a rather simplistic explanation of how policy works, but why I wanted to include this graphic is that this cycle has only increased in the last 10 years, where the auto industry is constantly reacting to various policies being either adopted or implementing. In fact, when you're in the throes of implementing one policy, you're in the beginning stages of adapting another one. And of course, all of this happens against a backdrop of a rapidly evolving consumer market, which policy, frankly, does have some impact on. But consumers, as we know, are fickle, especially when it comes to their transportation choices. So that's kind of how the cycle works, and then let's talk about who the players are on that field that influences that cycle, to use a sports analogy. At the federal level, right, there's three branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The legislative is largely responsible for passing laws, right? Tax laws and things like that. The executive branch responsible for administrating, enforcing those laws or those regulations. Judicial is, of course, the arbiter when there's disputes. And then states and municipalities, kind of that same setup. And then, of course, you have also local authorities. Zooming in on the federal government and the state government just for a second, in the executive branch. When I say the executive branch, it's not just right the president or his staff. It's often these agencies and people deep within the agencies, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, that holds under it the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, who's responsible for the CAFE program, IRS, because some of these incentives are done through the tax code. The IRS becomes a player in this. The Department of Energy is often tasked with distributing funds for those technology incentives. And then finally, the other player, especially from a state level, but they've become a real player at the federal level in this discussion, the California Air Resources Board. California has been at the forefront of fuel economy and EV regulations, so they are a stakeholder in these discussions. And it's not just the automakers who are a part of these discussions. There's the whole automotive ecosystem, from suppliers, trade associations, dealers, utilities, labor, and then non-governmental organizations, whether it's environmental groups, safety advocates, equity advocates, et cetera. So a lot of stakeholders involved in policy development and implementation when it comes to electric vehicles. Zooming in a bit to just the auto industry now, if I just think of automakers, and I apologize, this is a really busy slide with a lot of graphics on it, but I hope it gives you the sense for how complex the relationships are. On the right-hand side, what you see is probably not super comprehensive, but at least a good sampling of all of the brands, the global auto brands, right? And then the groups that those brands belong to. I've tried to highlight in green what I'll call the Detroit Three, right? General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, which still has the Detroit-based Jeep and Chrysler under it. They compete in the U.S. In North America with European and Asian manufacturers that you see there. And then I kind of grayed out, but I didn't want to forget about the overwhelming number of Chinese OEMs that have come on into this space in recent times. They play largely in China, but China is also now the world's largest exporter of vehicles. So they're important from a global development perspective. I know I focused a lot on the US, but we also have to consider global standards development. Another new phenomenon, you see Tesla there that I've highlighted, EV only manufacturers, right? That's another American manufacturer. There's also Rivian and Lucid kind of coming into this discussion now. And we all come to the policy discussion with a little different viewpoints based on our history, our manufacturing footprint, our sales footprint. But there are some common threads through all of this, right? And those are on the left. Automotive manufacturing is largely a low margin game, full stop. It's a capital intensive business with long lead times, right? You're talking 4, 5, 6 years to develop vehicles, highly regulated, as we discussed. The auto business is a massive impact to GDP and employment. There are so many, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but obviously one of the largest industries for employment in the US by the time you count auto manufacturers, suppliers, dealers, and all the tangential industries. And you can think that transportation really does enable the economy. We've seen that time and time again when there's shock to the system, and how transportation really does impact the overall economy and the transport of goods and services. And again, I would just highlight that the new phenomena are the existence of startup entrants with direct sales, and then the China OEM threat. I call it a threat. It's really a reality in most of the world. It's still only a threat really to the U.S. and Canada. There's of course other industry stakeholders. I'll just mention a few here. Besides the suppliers and the dealers, like we've talked about, heavy duty OEMs. So they're regulated under some slightly different regulations, but there's certainly some cross-pollination in these discussions when it comes to companies like Cummins or PACCAR or the Class 8 truck manufacturers, charge point operators, the people who operate the fast chargers all around the EVgo's charge points of the world. And of course, big oil, big ag, they're the fuels of the ICE vehicles, still very much a part of regulatory discussions and decarbonization discussions as we continue. So that's just a quick look at those. Continuing on, I'll get to the real discussion on the regulatory environment and then the incentives environment. But let's first talk about just kind of the regulatory environment. This is a slide I'm sure a lot of you have seen. It's global fuel economy and emissions regulations over time. I've put a little line in 2025 where we are today. You see, right, the kind of constant, persistent march towards lower and lower greenhouse gas emissions standard. These are all fleet level requirements, and the burden is on manufacturers, right? So the burden is not on customers, not on suppliers. The burden is on manufacturers. The details behind each of these lines are slightly different in each region, right? The U.S. Regulations are largely vehicle footprint based. The European regulations are weight based. Again, there's a lot of different kind of details that I won't get into, but the slope of those lines is clear. And there's also credit flexibilities in all of these schemes that are slightly different. The US and Europe, and now China, frankly, really lead these discussions. And they lead these discussions because that's where the majority of vehicles are manufactured, right? These other countries, largely import countries, you can think of this as kind of setting import policy, not necessarily manufacturing policy. So an important slide as we think about kind of global harmonization of requirements or deharmonization of requirements, as the case may be. Zooming into the U.S. Specifically, it gets even more complex, and I apologize for the small fonts on these slides, but you can see the slope of this line over time, starting in 2012, and then the changes to the slope in the red, and then the light blue. You wonder why that slope has changed. You can look at the x-axis there, right? It's election based. So we have the Obama standards turning into the Trump 1.0 standards, turning into the Biden standards, turning into Trump 2.0 standards, or potentially lack of standards. So again, it's a very evolving environment. I put those two flags there in 28 and 32 because there's two more elections, right? And elections are always kind of a 50-50 bet, especially at this time. So like I talked about before, manufacturers operate on much longer timeframes than 4 years. 4 years is not even a full vehicle life cycle. So trying to predict where these regulations are going to go, not only under the administration, but under the next administration, and how they're going to change is really critical as we consider product portfolio decisions and look at where the market's going. On the right, I show kind of the actual performance of the U.S. fleet. This is from an EPA report that gets published every year. Those blue bars reflect the actual performance of the fleet against the standard. So you can see in the early years of that regulation, the Obama regulation, the industry overperformed that standard, right? Meaning we emitted less CO2 than the standard would allow, and generated many credits. You can see for the last several years, industry has underperformed the standard, and what that means is they have to carry credits forward from previous years that were generated as allowed under the regulation, or purchase credits from other manufacturers. I also added a box just to give everybody a sense of scale there in terms of average vehicle emissions for vehicles that are sold today. Don't take this as a single vehicle, this is just kind of an average that I see in the SUVC segment, where you have an internal combustion engine, roughly 200 grams a mile. A hybrid improves that by about 25%. A plug-in hybrid gets you down to a 70 gram per mile, and then a battery electric vehicle is 0 grams per mile. So what you can think about here is, even a hybrid vehicle at some point becomes a negative actor. The battery electric vehicle being the best actor that you can have in your fleet, and it's able to offset a certain amount of ICE vehicles that have overperformed. And if you're trying to line up the numbers on the top chart and in the bottom chart, right, I didn't do full-size trucks are obviously numbers well above those that I showed for SUVC. So anyway, just wanted to give you an idea for how those emissions regulations work. And this is just one of those emissions regulations in the US, when in truth, the light duty fleet in the US is actually regulated by 6 different emissions regulations and 3 agencies. I think everyone probably knows about CAFE with NHTSA, and that's a fuel economy regulation. GHG, which I just showed on the previous slide, is regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency. There's also a criteria pollutant regulation, a separate regulation to control for things like particulate matter and NOx, et cetera. California has its own sets of regulations when it comes to greenhouse gas. They have the ZEV mandate, which I'm sure many of you have know about, and then also the LEV 4 criteria, which are similar to the federal regulation. The current administration now has, I'm sure you've seen, the current administration has taken action on several of these. They've set the CAFE penalties to $0 per mile, per tenth of a mile. So they've eliminated the financial penalty. They've challenged the underlying endangerment finding that underpins the greenhouse gas regulation. They've nullified both the California ZEV and LEV requirements through the Congressional Review Act. So this is all against a backdrop of maybe pulling back on the sticks, and then also pulling back on the incentives for electric vehicles that we'll talk about in a minute. So a very complex framework of regulations that change every 4 years. And I would also say that many of these end up getting challenged in court. So the process is even longer than that while you're waiting for ultimate adjudication of the dispute. So enough about the sticks. Let's talk about the fun stuff. Let's talk about the carrots. And this is an area that many people on the call probably know about. There's various ways that the federal government can incentivize manufacturers and research for electric vehicles. There's the long-term research funding that many of you know about, right? This gets funneled to the Department of Energy, national labs, universities. We, GM, have several projects in the battery space at various stages of development. Public-private consortia like LiBridge, many of you might be familiar with that. That was an effort a few years ago that helped inform the Department of Energy's battery roadmap. And then direct support through congressional action. So during the previous administration, there was both the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or IIJA, you might know it as, the Inflation Reduction Act. These are billions of dollars poured into the space for battery manufacturing, for supply chain development, for, again, consumer tax incentives. The Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Office, that was a loan program that gave low interest loans to many startups to enable them to start their business, their manufacturing business. And you could even throw NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, into this. That was $5 billion to build out EV infrastructure along highways. That program has just been restarted and uh, has some chargers finally going into the ground. But again, I think even with that, you see just the long lead time between when these acts are passed, when the money is allocated, and when the money is actually spent, and when the results are seen, often longer than election cycles. State and local tax credits and incentives for manufacturing, those have also been in the news a lot lately as well. In terms of scale, I just want to mention the scale of these, right? These programs were not millions of dollars. These were tens of billions of dollars programs. These rewards often were in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So this was significant investment by the government, well above, I'll call it historical levels of funding in the manufacturing and the electric vehicle space. Manufacturing tax incentives. This was one of the most uh, surprisingly durable aspects of the IRA, the manufacturing tax credit for producing battery cells. It provides $35 per kilowatt hour for cells made in the US, $10 per kilowatt hour for module and pack assembly. So this is a significant amount of money when you consider vehicles have batteries ranging from 60 to 200 kilowatt hours. The one big beautiful bill that was passed last year um, did place restrictions on these in terms of foreign entity of concern content, but these credits still do technically exist. I believe they sunset in 2032. So it's still a significant carrot that is out there for those manufacturers that can take advantage of it. And when we talk about this administration, they've certainly pulled back on a lot of that funding. But one thing they have shown an interest in is leaning in a little bit of a different way. So they're investing in companies or taking stakes in companies and also providing price supports. So a company like MP Materials, a rare earth producer in Texas, and Lithium Americas with their lithium mine project at Thacker Pass in Nevada are two such examples where the government actually has invested and is interested in taking equity stakes in this company. It's just another, I'll call it, method of investment in this space. And I think if I were a betting man in this space, there's probably more to come of investments like that. So the other type of incentive that is well known is the consumer incentive. We have 15 years of experience around the globe with various types of consumer incentives. But here's a framework to kind of help think about that, right? These incentives, these consumer incentives, subsidies are really meant to generate demand and scale for technology. They're really meant to provide a tailwind to the industry by subsidizing part of that difference between the cost of a battery electric vehicle and the price of an internal combustion engine vehicle. And what I mean by that, you're essentially trying to subsidize a portion of that battery because the cost difference is still there. They also try and target customers, right? You want to try and target customers below a certain price point with a vehicle or below a certain income threshold. In other words, no politician wants to be responsible for giving $7,500 to someone who buys $100,000 vehicle and makes $1 million a year. That's not a good look from a political perspective. So they try and target those as much as possible, or at least restrict those to I'll call it lower income or lower price point vehicles. But um, it's hard to do that. It's hard to target just those marginal customers. And what I mean by marginal customers is you'd love to only provide an incentive to a customer who wasn't going to buy an EV in the first place. And how do you do that? That's a really tough thing to do. You end up giving the incentive away to somebody that was already going to buy an EV. So it does become a little bit inefficient and expensive. And because it is expensive, and state governments especially, and the federal government, but especially state governments, money doesn't last that long, especially at higher and higher EV penetrations. So what we see in states is they oftentimes put incentives in place for a few weeks or months and then have to pull them back. And that just creates a lot of confusion with customers and dealers in the market of what exactly am I doing? What exactly discount do I get? And then what we've seen in many instances, whether it was Georgia in 2014 or the Netherlands in 2017 or Canada and Germany last year, EV adoption rates do drop off when incentives are discontinued. I think we'll see that, in the fourth quarter, maybe the first quarter hangover here in the U.S. as well, without that $7,500. But again, the money is powerful. States like Colorado have proven that incentives do work. They were able to drive EV adoption but those incentives were very generous in Colorado. $10,000 in some cases, but they were able to drive, close to 25 or 30% EV adoption with those incentives in place. Now, again, it remains to be seen what happens when those go away. And incentives don't stop at the vehicle. I think other states have considered other types of incentives, whether it's infrastructure and utility rebates or home and work charger rebates. I think that's an important one when a customer buys a vehicle and then has to spend several $1,000s installing a charger in their house. Rebates can help in that world too. I know DTE had a program in place for a long time here in Michigan. Non-monetary incentives like HOV lane access, free priority parking, those have proven powerful. So, for instance, in the California, HOV lane access, it's been proven was worth kind of several $1,000s worth of value, in terms of affecting people's vehicle choices there. And again, I'll mention the road funding, which is almost acting like a disincentive. So we not only have kind of a pullback on the federal incentives, but almost 40 states, I think I counted 39 right now, have implemented some sort of EV registration fee to replace the lost gas tax. And in some cases, that fee is punitive. It's not just replacing the gas tax. It's well and above over the gas tax. Just to give you an example, the state of Michigan just passed in their road funding budget a $260 per year road funding tax for EVs. When to replace the gas tax, that number's probably, and don't quote me on this, but in the $150 a year range is what the average consumer pays in state gas tax. So a few more slides as I wrap up. You can't have an EV policy discussion without talking about China. China has become a world leader in EVs and batteries within a decade. And how did they do that, right? I mean, I think they had a strategy, and I was over in China when the strategy was being developed in the mid 20 teens. They had a goal of 20% EV sales by 2025. In hindsight, that looks like a very modest goal. They're closer to 40 or 50% by now. Right? They wanted to provide OEMs with EV quotas. You must make a certain amount of EVs. They did that through ZEV mandates or fuel economy regulation. But more importantly, they took several actions to create an EV economy. First was a massive investment in public charging. Millions of public charging poles is what they call them over there, because people, frankly, don't live in single family homes. They have millions of charge points now there. On the consumer side, a lot of action. So a lot of consumer incentives, just subsidization of the vehicle cost. But probably the single most effective one was their license plate rules, where if you were to buy an EV, you would get a quote unquote free license plate. If you bought anything other than an EV, you went into a lottery for the license plate and you had to pay several $1,000s to get that license plate to be able to drive on certain roads. So A lot of action on the consumer side to generate that demand. And on the battery and supply chain side, they did an equal amount of work. They went to secure global mineral assets. So the cobalt, the nickel, the manganese, the lithium that goes into batteries. They purchased interests in mines and extraction facilities all over the globe. They also scaled up the refining and processing capacity. So the nickel sulfate facilities, the cobalt sulfate facilities, the precursor, the cathode, the anode, all of that. And I think, as you've read, most of that is now concentrated in China. Also, at the end of that supply chain, massive investment in vehicle and in battery manufacturing. A couple things I'll point out. They didn't get it all right away. Because of the way China is run politically, their central planning, rapid decision making, they could react to changing market conditions very quickly. Consumer incentives, on again, off again, a whole of government, whole of industry approach. And I'll say one thing that I observed also when I was over there. Quite frankly, they didn't have the beginning car culture of the US and Europe. And what I mean by that is many customers who were purchasing an EV were literally purchasing their first vehicle and didn't have a history of gas powered vehicles in that lifestyle or going to the gas station. And so when you're starting kind of from scratch with a person and you say this is just how the vehicle works now as you plug it in, that's a big advantage where, I'll call it gasoline or ICE culture, and the way just that the US has developed over the last 50 to 75 to 100 years. That's an impediment because people are just used to, that's what I do with my vehicle, and overcoming that with charging infrastructure and road trips is a little more challenging. So just wanted to provide you that kind of context around China. They've been able to do a lot of great things, but there's also some significant differences and why they could do those things maybe a little different than any of the Western regions. And finally, trade policy. I'll just go quickly over this. It has been important in the auto industry forever. Autos have gone through a period of globalization, and I think we're in probably a period of deglobalization. And again, this is really independent of electric vehicles, but it has a big impact on the EV market and other policies. Trade policy is free trade agreements, tariffs, export controls, conditions on manufacturing or tax incentives. So like I said, those manufacturing tax credits or even part of the consumer tax credits were based on vehicles being manufactured in the US. Europe has kind of some de facto trade policies buried in their emissions regulations, where a certain percentage of the battery needs to be sourced from internal to Europe. Again, just like any of these other policies, stability and certainty are desired. Agility is a real advantage here. And I'll make a final comment about this is that the mineral supply chains that are being developed in the EV battery space have never really been a part of the automotive supply chain space, but now they are. So how that plays into the development of the supply chain is really important. But we at GM, we have to stay resilient, redundant, robust supply chains, and trade policy has a lot to do with that. So if there is a change in trade policy, we have the ability to be agile and switch to other suppliers in a more advantageous area. So one final slide to kind of tie it all together before we open it up for questions. I hope I've explained that policy is vitally important to the EV market. And again, a combination of carrots and sticks, as all policies are. Many different stakeholders with different interests in this discussion. Politics and especially geopolitics play outsized roles given the impact to GDP and employment and the economy. It becomes vitally important that, or politics becomes important. and this is happening at an ever increasing rate, as I discussed. Bipartisan solutions are much more durable than partisan solutions. I think that's obvious, but I wanted to state that, right? Bipartisan solutions tend to be durable, more durable than every 4 years, every 8 years. So where we can find agreement about um, uh, what's important to the US, whether it's decarbonization, whether it's national security, or whether it's energy dominance, whatever you want, it's important that all of those discussions try and be as bipartisan as possible. I can't emphasize enough how important stakeholder education is. I think we've all seen in this space misinformation travels much faster and is much more pervasive than facts. And finally, I think we have to realize we're still really talking about battery cost, battery cost, battery cost. It's all about that cost per kilowatt hour at a cell and a pack level and getting to cost parity with internal combustion engine solutions. So we at GM, right, how do we think about this? We really try to remain agile in our planning, manufacturing planning. We try to build bipartisan relationships. And what does that mean? That means when Republicans are in power, you still have to talk to the Democrats. That means when the Democrats are in power, you still have to talk to the Republicans. You can't ignore one side. You have to, again, try and negotiate some of those find those bipartisan solutions. Stakeholder market education is massive. And whenever we can go as an entire industry with solutions or with ideas to governments, that's better, right? There's power when the entire industry can speak with one voice instead of just a few companies. And I think that's played out over the past year with a couple issues. And finally, we're going to continue our R&D investments and supply chain relationships, bring that battery cost lower, increase domestic security, right? We believe in electric vehicles. They are still our North Star. And we believe that the US has a big role to play in that. We need to make batteries here. We need to make EVs here. And EVs are the future because they're simply better vehicles. So with that, thank you. I'll open it up to questions, and thanks for your time today.
All right, great job, Mike. This is Jamie from the EV Center. I just want to share a few questions that we've already received in the chat. Feel free to add some more. Good presentation. From a policy perspective, how do you or other OEMs consider the volatility in policy when thinking about future product platforms? Like, is the focus more on flexible platforms, like producing an ICE or EV in the same plant, or is it more global platforms, i.e. get scale by shipping EVs anywhere in the world based on demand, or is there a different approach?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's both. I think um, a couple things on that. There's volatility in policy, certainly. There's also volatility on our view of the future market, which is in some ways influenced by policy, but also influenced by what we learn about consumers, right? And I think in 2025 here, we have a view of consumers and electric vehicles that's much different than we had in 2020 because we have a full portfolio. GM has 14 nameplates of EVs out there, oftentimes alongside their ICE counterparts. And we're learning a lot. So I think the ability to back when we were, I guess the answer depends on the time frame you're looking at. Back when everybody was expecting 50% EVs by 2030, we were in a race. We were in a race to secure minerals. We were in a race to electrify our facilities. We were in a race. And it was it was not necessarily about agility. Um, Now that we're looking at kind of the future is a lot more uncertain, I'd say that variability around what the slope of that EV adoption curve looks like. I think the only thing anybody can agree on is it's going up. We have to remain agile and nimble to be able to produce ICE or EVs for longer, and then but still stay nimble enough for when if an inflection point does happen, if that battery breakthrough does happen, and somebody really hits on that right EV formula, we can quickly increase production. And I think the global issue is another one. And as much as we'd like, globally harmonized requirements, we have to look kind of that they're not at this time. And then you have to decide kind of region by region what your solution is, and then again try and bring that together in planning. But it's a delicate balance. But I think the word for now, I think the word in 5 years ago was about capacity. I think the word now is agility, if that makes sense. And I think that's what we have to consider, making smart investments in both ICE and EVs, continuing those EV investments, but realizing that inflection point might be a few years longer than we had thought. One thing I'll say though is we no longer have discussions with with the utilities or anybody else about EVs crashing the grid. Right? There's not those that was because that capacity concern was on the utility side too. So that's the good news is EVs having this little slower adoption rate maybe give us a little better chance at integrating with some of these grids. And so EVs, by the time they do get to enough kind of critical mass, can become those grid assets like we talked about.
Another Michael says, it seems that many companies have been pulling back from hydrogen, even though some analyses suggest that it could have a lower overall carbon footprint than EVs once the mining and materials aspects are factored in. Do you have any insight into how you see hydrogen's future relative to electric vehicles?
Yeah, great question. We did make some announcements around hydrogen too. I think the cost of hydrogen has always been a very interesting theoretical solution. I think what people have looked at and what the realization now, and again, I'm not speaking just for GM, but for the overall market, the cost of making that hydrogen, or specifically the cost of trying to make green hydrogen, looks to be still cost prohibitive. And it in the light duty space and increasingly in the medium and heavy duty space, it looks like the market has spoken. The future for, call it, battery research appears to be progressing at a rate more than the hydrogen research. And it's really difficult to kind of keep this dual path going. And it seems like, right, the battery path is kind of won out for now. I think there's still research to be done on hydrogen and potential applications, but hydrogen for, I'll call it, transportation, especially light duty, that die has already been cast.
Yet another Michael asks, where do you think U.S. policy is most behind? If you could get only one, would you push for more R&D investment, supply chain incentives, battery EV manufacturing tax breaks, consumer tax breaks, charging infrastructure, or something else?
Very selfishly, battery manufacturing IP. It all exists in Asia. We are behind in terms of developing not just the chemistries. And I think I didn't maybe make this clear enough too. When we think of intellectual property and batteries, we think there's two things, right? There's the chemistries, the NMCs, the LFPs, whatever. But then there's how to actually make the cells. Okay, all of that IP, the overwhelming majority, still exists in Asia. We as a U.S., batteries are a national security. They need to be made here. We need to understand how to make them. We need to understand how to make them in massive quantities. And again, that's for whether it's for electric vehicles, whether it's for drones, whether it's for anything else, those batteries should be made here. And I think, consumer tax credits, I'd love those. I'd love to stimulate the market, but that battery production China is so far ahead in that. I think that's the real place we should if I had one, that would be priority one. We GM have come up with a new chemistry called, lithium manganese rich that we're going to be putting into vehicles here in a couple of years. And that chemistry was with the IP is here for that, which is awesome, right? But again, how do we teach ourselves how to make that? We still need Asian partners to make that. So I think making that at large scale, whether it's for vehicles, stationary storage, drones, VTOLs, it doesn't matter. We need to make that here. It should be part of an energy dominance agenda, battery manufacturing.
I'll take that opportunity to put in a plug for the U of M EV Center's battery lab. We have a new state-of-the-art facility that's available for reservations from companies, battery researchers. Come on in, test out your formulas. Maybe you can come up with something even better. Sean asked, does the need to fight on two fronts, continue manufacturing ICE vehicles while still developing EV strategy, put the traditional manufacturers like GM in a disadvantageous position versus pure play EV players such as Tesla?
Great question. Couple things on that. So the ICE business for us allows us to take some of the profits from that and invest it in EVs. And again, when I say the time frame for EVs, the slope for EVs is the adoption of EVs is longer. Again, it's getting to what I'll call cost or price parity looks maybe a little further out too. So what we're able to do is take those profits from electric vehicles, or I'm sorry, from internal combustion vehicles, and pour them in to EV development. The capital that the EV only manufacturers are pouring into EV development is largely from credit purchases from other auto manufacturers. So, the regulatory environment has had a large impact on EV only manufacturers to the tune of tens of billions of dollars of investment that they've been able to make in their EV development because of money transfers from other manufacturers. So I don't think it's a disadvantage. I think it's an advantage that we're able to be agile, to use those profits from the ICE business and pour them into the EV business, to be able to react wherever, again, whatever the slope of that EV adoption curve looks like.
And we have time for one last question. This is from Srini. Is the shift from capacity to agility based on one, a higher than natural push by regulation, and two, a collective failure by the industry to truly understand the U.S. consumers and their lack of desire/ability to shift to an all-electric future in an aggressive timeline? Is this a clash between regulation and consumer demand that the industry got wrong?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Srini. Thanks. I know Srini. I think I wouldn't say industry got wrong. I would say industry, Wall Street, the regulators, everyone. It was a bit of a virtuous cycle that over indexed on the overall demand for EVs. And now the regulations once consumer demand started to, and the regulations reflected that too. The regulations reflected that enthusiasm about battery cost curves. We had some significant step downs in battery costs, and people thought the battery costs would just keep coming down at a pretty high rate, right? And what happens is we kind of plateaued there for a few years until we get that next big step function. So I'd say, and by the way, this is not the first time the auto industry and regulators and everybody else have kind of misjudged the future market, right? So I think it was kind of, I'm not going to blame anybody. It was kind of a virtuous cycle from all the stakeholders involved that maybe got a little too ambitious with consumer adoption forecasts, battery cost forecasts, etc. And quite frankly, the infrastructure is nowhere near there to support the level of adoption we were talking about either. So again, I think we're in a very different spot with 100 nameplates industry-wide of EVs. Remember, back when these regulations and all these targets were being set, there were only a handful of EVs on the market. So there's a lot of speculation about where that would handle. And now we have some very real data about those barriers. I think that's the biggest thing is people got wrong is people thought once price parity or close to price parity happened, consumers would adopt these at a rapid rate. And I think what we've seen is there's still a lot of barriers to consumer adoption in terms of infrastructure, how they feel about the batteries, how they feel about the range. There's still a lot of those barriers were a lot larger than industry, regulators, Wall Street, whoever thought. So it's kind of a collective overconfidence or over forecast. And now, again, carrots and sticks, we just need all of those to move at the same time and try and move along this industry. Again, the market is still increasing. We're just talking about the slope of that line, and it's not a hockey stick anymore. It's more of a slow growth scenario. But thanks for the question, Srini.
Thanks,
Michael,
Mike.
I just wanted to really, on behalf of the Electric Vehicle Center, to really thank you to allow us in a very complex and diverse kind of subject to allow to summarize all this and put your arms around for the benefit of the audience. So thank you so much for taking the time, and I'm sure there's many other questions that we will make sure to send to you so that we can respond it offline. But thank you very much, and have a wonderful weekend, all of us.
Thank you, and go blue.